I have some things to tell you, but I don't have all the answers. I want to say one thing. We had a reference to Ted Cruz earlier today. I do not come from Ted Cruz country. I come from Minnesota. Minnesota is, like Austria, a land that has a lot of empty spaces in it. We actually have a lot more empty spaces than you do. We are 3 times the size and half the population. Like Austria, we are landlocked. We have some nice big lakes, in fact, quite a few of them, but as you can see, no mountains. So this is a real treat for me to be here. Culturally, however, there are more similarities than there would be. If you would feel far more at home if you went to visit Minnesota than you would if you went to visit Texas. Why? Because Minnesota was settled by Norwegians, Swedes, and Germans. Now that is its historical perspective, but it does bring a very strong sense of the importance of a Northern European cultural expectation. So Minnesotans, like Austrians, are a little more polite than some Americans. They're a little more reserved than some Americans. They're much less interested in making big arguments or grandstanding than some of the Americans that you see on television. So I'm not trying to say that we have the same culture. In fact, we don't. So that's what we look like, and I would like to go on and make one more point. We do have some things in common. I think, and these are things that I think Europeans and North Americans have in common. We're largely individualistic cultures. Masculinity refers to a preference for being stimulated at work rather than just having nice personal relationships at work. And we have a moderately long-term orientation. Not as long-term as Japan, much longer term than some other countries which have very short term. So those are the things we have in common. We also are different, and I'm not going to go into this with any detail except to say that Americans tend to think leaders are wonderful and will save them from every possible problem. That's what they hope. Whenever there's a problem, we think a leader will get us out of it. Austrians are a little bit more distrustful of this, and that Americans tend to be risk takers, and Austrians are a little bit more. So in general, there are some differences and some similarities, and so I don't pretend to want to overemphasize those, but we need to say, what can we learn from each other, and what don't we? Like, if I did that on the table when I was in Minnesota, they would think I was being very rude. So, not so here. I was shocked. Insofar as you can be shocked in Austria, right? What's going on? Okay. I have a lot more slides here than I would typically do if I were speaking to an English-speaking audience, because I know you're listening in another language. So I'm not going to read to you, but this is important. I think all countries now in education are in an area of transformation. We are being asked to do things very differently than the way we did them even 25 years ago. And I think this is important. And I'm not going to read it to you. You can read it to yourself. I want to say my mother lived for her first 14 years in a home that had no electricity. And she was not poor. It's just that there wasn't any electricity in rural areas. The first time I came to Europe, I came on a boat because you couldn't fly. And we know now that my children can Skype all over the world. It's a very different world, and the children growing up in this world have a very different experience. I'm in a transitional generation. I have no idea what will happen to my adorable grandchildren, which I'm not going to show pictures of them, but they're very cute. So the world is changed, and education has changed less. We know that. That's our challenge. The other thing we know is that as educators, we didn't decide we wanted to change. We are being asked to change. We're being asked to change by the circumstances outside us, by policymakers, by comparative results from international tests. And this is an important observation, I think. Change is hard. And I think change is particularly hard because there's another observation that I want. We have traditions, and those traditions are important to the people no matter where they live. Traditions keep us in society together. Rousseau said that. It's true today. We need to think about what is our social compact. That's the conserving tradition. And education is one of the conserving traditions. It's the way we decide, as Rousseau said, it's the way we decide in Durkheim, way we decide what our children are, how they're going to identify themselves, what they're going to know and be able to do. So education is in some ways the brake. The business sector may be plummeting headlong into the future. We also have to prepare children to live in the world of today, and in a world where they must also get along with their parents and grandparents. So we are in this immediately tense position of being asked to change radically, but also being asked by other parts of our societies to keep things pretty much the same. This is our challenge. It's a tremendous cultural challenge because we are the point in many societies where these competing forces play out. Business wants us to look one way. Parents of the school want us to look another way. So those competing pressures in my country, they often lead to something you might call status or paralysis. We don't know what to do. There can be a win-lose argument, which probably is less prevalent in a country which refines its debates in more subtle ways. Are we going to have all private schools, like they do in Chile practically? Or are we going to have just change our public schools in a different way? There are rapid changes inside schools that leave teachers confused, that leave school leaders confused about how they're going to help teachers and parents confront a new requirement. We get a lot of burnout. We get a lot of burnout. In my country, we get a lot of burnout among teachers. We get a lot of burnout among school leaders because of these competing pressures. Again, this problem of managing these conflicting expectations is something that we need to think about when we talk about training principles, because this is their world. So then there comes the question, and the question that's really intrigued me for many years now, until I met Michael and he got me interested in political cultures, which is the culture of schools. I've studied the culture of schools. I've also studied culture within universities and how it changes and how it doesn't. So the question is, can school culture, I'm going to just frame it in terms of the school now, can school culture be a powerful tool for change? Now, a few years ago, people talked a lot about this, and it was assumed that culture was a management tool. But I have some different assumptions. I think culture is very, very deeply embedded. It changes very slowly. Even if you start a new school from scratch and have all new teachers come into it, you have to deal with what they bring in from their old positions, from their own experiences. It takes a long time. But it can change. I've seen it, and I've seen it even here in a school that I visited yesterday. Culture affects how people feel, but it also affects student learning. I have a lot of data from the United States on that. Some people in the Netherlands who've used some of my research instruments have also found that that's the case there as well. How about leadership? And when I say leadership, I'm talking about the principal and other people who hold formal positions of leadership in schools, because that is different between different countries. They help to shape culture. They help to shape culture. But I have not seen an instance in any country that I have gone to where they do it on their own. They do it along with other people in the school. So culture change is team sport. It's not an individual sport. And that's particularly important. It requires more than one person, and it usually requires more than a very small team of people as well. I think there's a rule of thumb in the change literature that I know that says, don't move ahead until you have about 25% of the people who are willing to go along with you. Then you'll get another 20% who were holding back but see that something's happening. And some people will never change. So if you wait until everybody's ready to go, you're never going to change. I think there are cultural challenges in Austria, and they're very similar to the ones that I see in the United States. There are these competing pressures for transformation and conservation. In Austria, of course, people are still very deeply attached to the German-type school system with vocational education and gymnasium-type education. That's part of the culture. People don't want to give that up. That's a conserving force. People like it. They don't really want it to change that much. The transformational forces, as they are in the United States, are, well, we're not doing quite as well on international tests as we thought we would. Why not? What do we need to change in order to do that? We also, both in your country and mine, have another problem that emerges from international test results. Our countries are not among the most equitable in their outcomes. Low-income children, minority children do worse in Austria and the United States than they do in a lot of other countries. That is, of course, something that we don't like. And it's an initiative in Austria. It's been an initiative in the United States for a while. It's a very slow process of change. So I think that the difference between how teachers and parents and principals and policymakers are dealing with this issue is very, very important. And that's the context in which school principals work and other school leaders work. And even school board members who have to negotiate between different constituencies in their municipal environment. So, I should have had that up there first. That was an OECD report. All right, so here are the business books that were very popular in the, I can go back to that. Those were very popular in the 1980s. They said, and led to the conclusion that you can use culture to get great from good. And this is good to great. And that's probably one of the most popular books read by school principals in the United States. They all want to go from good to great. There's only one problem with that, and that is, I think, virtually all of the business management literature, which I do keep up with because I think it's important. That's what goes into the minds of a lot of policymakers. Virtually none of it applies very quickly to the school environment. I know that's true in my environment. I suspect it's true in yours. In part because there are significant cultural differences. There are significant cultural differences for good reasons, too. And I'm going to point out, this is something I took from my good colleague, Michael Schratz, and I'm sure all of you have seen it. Michael has had enormous influence on the way I think about this. But I think that we are moving from the idea that we need to be managers of our schools to leaders of our schools. And yet we know that we also need to continue to manage them well if we are going to lead them. Again, this puts the principals that I've worked with and studied in a very difficult situation because they know in the United States we use an analogy that you wouldn't use here. They have to make sure the school buses run on time because if a child doesn't get home when they're supposed to, they could be in a lot of trouble. So that's the management side. That's not a very exciting leadership task. On the other hand, they're being asked to completely change the way in which teachers work together, being asked to implement very new curricula. They're being asked to adopt all sorts of business practices that were not there before. They're expected to become coaches. Nobody 20 years ago expected principals to be coaches. I mean, there were probably some natural coaches out there, but we didn't ask people to do that. So we have this, I put a jagged line in there, which didn't work out very well in the PowerPoint. Sorry, Michael. Between school management and school leadership to say those are very permeable barriers, and every good principal has to move back and forth between these. Because parents expect management. Your ministry expects good management. They also expect leadership. And we know that we will not be able to change the culture without that. So you have to actually say what's happening to the principal's work. I've been doing some time studies of principals' work in the United States. And one of the biggest challenges that many of them face is that the expectations for the amount of time that they're going to spend on management practices has not gone down at all. And yet they're being asked to take on these new leadership practices, the coaching, the instructional leadership. Where are they going to find the time? It's particularly difficult for secondary school principals who have larger schools, more complicated schools, much more pressure with the environment because they're sending their children out to universities or to jobs. With those challenges, how are principals spending their time? We don't, in my university, we train principals or we prepare principals. We provide professional development for principals. We never actually ask this question because I don't get to decide what they learn. How do they decide how to spend their time? An important, critical, because the principal that I spoke with yesterday, I said, well, and where do you spend your time? How much time do you spend talking to teachers about their instruction or looking at classrooms? She said, half. My jaw dropped. I have never met a principal in the United States of a secondary school who spent that much time on that kind of work. You have to make hard choices to do that. But if you're going to change the culture, we have to change the way in which people look at their work. This is actually a frozen bus. Now, Jim Collins, who wrote Good to Great, uses the image of a bus as part of his image. I would say probably many of the schools that I've worked with look more like this. This picture, by the way, is not from the United States. This is it's from the Netherlands, and I would like to credit my colleague Jennifer Yorkbar who took it. It's actually, however, from the Netherlands, outside, very near a place that I lived for a year. So what does it take to unfreeze culture? What does it take to get the bus ready to move? That is the million euro question, excuse me. I think we have to remember what the essentials are of educational culture and why it's important. And this is what makes the business applications difficult in many circumstances. The first thing is we have a much different definition who belongs on that bus. You know, in a business, it's the people who work there. That's it. But we have lots of stakeholders who think they have a right to get on the bus with us almost all the time. So the bus is very crowded, and not everybody who gets on the bus has the same mindset with them. And that's important because that's part of our conserving tradition, but it's also part of who we are. We don't want to change that. We are public institutions. We have a responsibility to all these stakeholders. So that makes us very different from a business environment. A second thing is that we have a focus on learning, and that's our core business. Most businesses produce something that they can see from beginning to end, with the exception of a very research-intensive business. Most of the time, whatever they're producing, they can see and plan out when it's going to come out. We get children in preschool, and we don't know how they're going to turn out for another 20 years sometimes. It's very hard to think about how you measure or think about that long-term perspective. And so what happens with that? Because we can't see what happens 20 years, we tend to focus on what's happening right now, this year, this group of students who's come into my school. So we end up focusing in on too short a term. That's a tension that we all have, I think, in education. this I think is incredibly important. People who go and work in business often love their jobs. I have 2 daughters who are not in education. They like their work. They like the people they work with. They're stimulated. But we are staffed by professionals, and they are drawn into this occupation because they have a higher sense of purpose. I mean, if you scratch any teacher, one of the reasons, there are a lot of reasons they go into education, but a sense of being committed to the welfare of children almost always underlies it, unless they have been totally burned out and have become totally cynical. That's not why they go in. Nobody goes into education because they want to make a lot of money. And finally, we have the issue of trust. How do we create trust? We talked about that before today. How do we create the kind of trust so that we can change the tires on the bus while starting to unfreeze it and get it moving at the same time? That is a very hard job. Changing the tires on a moving bus is one of the phrases that we use to talk about how school change will work, because we are actually doing it while we are trying to repair it at the same time. We have no luxury of spending a year to plan something new. We are usually told how to do it very quickly. That's important. That is our culture. That is not going to change in the near future. Those are fundamentals. So we need a stronger culture at the school level. What does that mean? Culture that we can think about changing. We can't actually change the things that I talked about before. Those are social contracts. We can change some of the things that happen in a school, or a university for that matter, by the way, for those of you who are. What are the elements of school culture? I think these are, I've been working on some of this now in a large project which is focused on leadership and how leadership affects learning. And I'm working with a former doctoral student, Musung Lee, and we have been working on elements of school culture that make a difference. And I think there are 3 of them. How we solve problems, how adults work together, and then how we work with students. Those are the 3 components of culture that we actually have to think about if we're going to think about changing. So how we solve problems, I'm going to start with that one. First, we have to say, in our school, how do we think about how we solve problems? First, we have to think about which problems do we choose to solve, because we have a choice. Education is a bottomless pit of problems. We will never run out of problems to solve. So we have to decide which ones we're going to solve. Are we going to look at those things that are coming at us from outside, or those things that are happening inside? And that will vary. We're going to have to pay attention to both of them. If you have a group of teachers who are not getting along in the science department, you better fix that. If we have a new mandate from the ministry, we have to pay attention to that. We also have a lot of turbulence. Things change quickly. You may be in a period of low change in a country or a period of relative tranquility. In that, we can say that there are 4 different kinds of cultures. And we see these in different countries. Almost all, and to a great extent, we'd have to say, all school systems exist in a bureaucratic culture. It's the way in which we are all organized. It doesn't matter what country you're in. Some countries have a very competitive culture. I would not say that I have seen that to a great extent in Austria, but I'm not going to comment on it because I haven't been here very long. But what we do know from studies in the United States is that the schools that work best are the ones that have a very flexible approach to the problems that they choose, which is largely up to the principal to mediate those. Which problems they choose to focus on, internal or external, and how they choose to react to the environment. And one of the things, this finding actually was stimulated a long time ago. I studied principals in very, very deprived urban high schools in the 1980s. And one of the things we found from the effective principals is that they were masterful at deciding which problems to ignore. Not which problems to solve, which problems they didn't have to pay attention to. Because otherwise they were overwhelmed. What we do know, and that's been affirmed in a number of other studies, what we do know is that they have to move between being cooperative, which is focusing more on the inside. So they have to think about how we're creating networks inside our schools as well as outside our schools. They have to think about how we design the policies, the schedules, the procedures to encourage teamwork. And even in a very bureaucratic organization, which the school systems that I work with are probably even more bureaucratic than Austrian schools, you have the capacity to change the school schedules to some extent so that you can program in times for people to work together. That turns out to be one of the best predictors of whether or not you're going to have any kind of culture change. So I think this one is very important. And we talked about cooperation this morning, so I really don't think I need to go on that. The adaptive culture piece of it says we actually have to keep monitoring. We have to be at the edge of our organization. We have to anticipate what's coming. We don't wait for it to come. We actually look and see what is the ministry going to, in my country, the school board and the state, of course, are the main policy actors. What's coming? What's happening to our demographics? Are we getting more immigrant students in our catchment area? Whatever's happening. What kinds of policies do we need to help our teachers respond to this? Because teachers are, if they don't have the tools, they can't effectively work with new students, new different kinds of students that may be coming in. And this is probably even more important. Who gets to take risks and experiment when things are changing rapidly? How do we reward experimentation, which means that we also have to not punish failure? We know from research that people learn best from small failures. So you have to provide an environment in which people feel good about making small experiments that are not going to harm students, are not going to cause the school to close, but are going to move the culture forward. That's very, very critical. And this, again, comes from research that this is what teachers have told me long ago, before we entered this period of international testing. I do this because my principal will let me do this, and if it doesn't work, it's okay. So, and this is very increasingly important, particularly in the United States where people move a lot more than they do here. You have to begin and strategically energize and relate to the community that sends their children to you. Okay, how do we work with students? That's the second triangle. There are two components to the school's culture that you need to think about here. And in the research that we've done, there are mostly in the United States, they look at, how much pressure is there on students to learn? How much pressure is there on teachers to perform better, to get the results up, to do better on whatever examination system you have, to send more students on to university? Whatever criteria are you being used to evaluate the schools? That's what we call academic press, keeping the focus on the goal of getting the students to perform, learn well. The other piece of it, however, that we don't pay much attention to, and I think Austria pays more attention to, is student support. The whole student, the Bildungs approach, which is an untranslatable word, by the way. There's no English equivalent. So you think about how these are to be balanced, then one of the things we found in our research is that unless you have both of them, you won't get student learning. You need to have both of them in roughly equal. And you know why? Because students, they have a different relationship with the school when they feel like I'm being challenged, I'm being asked to work beyond where I'd be comfortable, but also it's okay for me to fail. It's okay, I can take a risk in my classroom because I know I won't be punished, and I know that my teachers and the school care about my success. So those are the schools that we find over time are doing well with culture change. They have more adaptive cultures. In particular, they're more adaptive internally. Now, the third piece of this is the one where I've done most of my research, and I want to apologize for the PCOLT, because you can't write professional, community, organizational learning, and trust on a PowerPoint. And so I had to find an acronym for it. And I want to be very clear here. I am not talking about, or rather I'm saying professional learning communities is the term that tends to be used in Europe and increasingly in the United States. All three of these go into something that's called a professional learning community or a community of practice. So they are not, professional community is not the same as professional learning community. You can have professional community without having a lot of forward movement. You certainly need trust. So it's the underlying social constructs that can lead you to something that might be a professional learning community. Professional community has a number of key characteristics that have been affirmed not only in research in the United States but in Europe. Their key characteristics are that people have thoughtful discussions, what we could call reflective practice, that they collaborate, and I'm going to distinguish collaboration from cooperation. There are a lot of schools that are very cooperative, but collaboration means they're producing something together, whether it's a new curriculum, a set of shared practices, a kind of review of what our students are learning, so an informal testing system. They have shared norms and values. They talk about it. They don't just assume that everybody else agrees with them. They actually talk about it. Oh, you did that. Can you tell me why? You know, I wouldn't have thought about it that way. So those conversations come up, and there is this focus on student learning. And I think the focus on student learning is important because everybody says, oh, of course all teachers do that. No, most focus on their teaching. You can focus on teaching and how well you're doing in front of the classroom, which is what I'm doing right now, without focusing on what you're learning. Now, I don't have you in my class for very long, so I won't know how much you're learning. But if I'm a teacher, I have to be able to focus on what people are learning, not on how well I am teaching. And I've been in many, many schools where teaching was the focus of a great deal of discussion and very little discussion about what students are learning until a test result comes back, which is not very meaningful for most teachers. Okay, so the benefits are, when we've seen this, are very strongly associated with teachers feeling empowered, they feel efficacious, they're more likely to take risks, they're more likely to do things in their classroom that are a little bit beyond their current capacities. They're more likely to go to a professional development and come back and say, I could try that. So that's empowerment and efficacy. They're more likely, the key in the United States, and also it turns out in the Netherlands, to student learning is for teachers in the school as a whole to have some sense of responsibility for student learning beyond their classroom. Beyond their classroom. It's our job as a school to make sure that the student who leaves at the end of whatever form it is, it would be at the end of 6th grade in the United States, at the end of 9th grade, at the end of, that they know what we want them to know. So you have to have some consensus around what you want to make sure that the students in one form are talking to, the teachers in one form are talking to the teachers in the other forms. Are we getting them ready? Did we do a good job? What do we need to work on next year? That does not happen in a lot of schools, in the United States anyway. And that leads to better instruction. Now, how do principals work into this? I think if I had to change anything about our principal leadership preparation program, I would make them take a course in ethnography. Because I think most of us are inclined, as we go in our rounds and our administrative work, to see the things that we want to fix. But if you're a good school leader, you can see, are these pieces here? Or where am I finding the gaps? Which department isn't collaborating? Which department is having superficial conversations in their meetings? You can hear it, you can see it, but you have to pay attention. So you need to be a watcher and a listener, not a teller. That's not easy for most leaders. The second piece of this, aside from professional community, is organizational learning. And it has three components in my work. It has memory, and I'm going to go through these later, a knowledge base, and learning processes. So in order to get to a learning community, you have to have all three of these pieces. Now, because it's easier for you to read, I put this slide in. Memory. Memory is very important. Schools, teachers stay a long time in most schools. They know what happened 5 years ago. They know what happens when they get a new principal, how we handle it. They know what happened when we failed at doing something that we were told to do a few years ago and felt really bad about it but didn't talk about it. Or they have a story, one school that I went to, the story was 5 years ago, we rebuilt the entire playground in one weekend with the parents. We can do anything. You know, a school that feels has that kind of story circulating versus the school that says, we can't do anything right. You know, every time we try this new innovation, they change it on us, and just as we're getting used to it, then we have to start again. That's a different kind of story. That's really important. That memory is important. The stories people tell are important. The knowledge base. Schools often are treated as if they're just consumers of knowledge. Schools create knowledge. They collect their own information. They process their own information. It's not research the way I do research, but it's their research, and it's important. So they have to know how to get information from the outside, what's important in that information, when do I pay attention to research, and when do I say it's not really relevant to me right now. The principal in every study that I've done is often a gatekeeper that says, it's my job to screen what comes in. What is the knowledge from the outside the school that I would like people to pay attention to? The teachers are often, in collaboration with the principal, the ones who create the knowledge about our circumstances, our school, how we do things, what are the challenges facing us, what information do we need? So it's a combination. But if you don't have a knowledge base, and you don't say we have a knowledge base, it's hard to be a learning organization. And then they have to have a process, and that's where it overlaps with professional community. They have to have opportunities and an understanding, a common understanding of how we deal with new information. How do we talk about it? Where do we talk about it? What do we do about it? And if they don't have that, it doesn't matter if they have good information or if they have good memories. They won't be able to make use of any new information. And I think this is important. I think this is really important. We know that adults don't learn by reading. Even I read a lot. I read dissertations. But I learn from talking to my students about what they're doing. I can't advise other people on their research just by reading their research. I have to actually talk to them about what is it that you wanted? Why did you organize it this way? We have to process in order to learn. It's true for children, but it's even more so for adults. Trust. Why is trust important? And why do we think it's particularly important for principals? There are lots of different kinds of trust, but I want to highlight this particular kind. Now, some of the big challenges in Austria and in the United States are coming because of the changing patterns of immigration, which pose challenges to our understanding of who we are and how we're all alike. I don't want to talk about that today. That's another talk. But I think here we say the relational trust among the professionals within the school is important. And most teachers will say, I trust my colleagues. Far fewer of them will say, I really trust my principal. Even fewer say, I really trust my parents, that they will be there for me. So if you look at where the trust lies, you know where the holes are. My friend and colleague Megan Shannon Moran has done wonderful work on this, and it's all available on her website for free, including her instruments, which are designed to be used by schools. They are not, of course, in German. So why do we care about this? These three elements. There's a lot of research, and I've only got 2 citations down that say these things lead to students having a stronger sense of community and belonging in the school. And we know that students who feel that they belong in their school and that the school is supportive will learn more. Instruction is better. When teachers do these things, you can go in and you can see it. You can walk into the classrooms. You can actually see it. And you have a much better chance of being successful when you need to change. All of those things are associated empirically with student learning, measured any way you want to. In one study, we measured it by student-written products that they produced in their classrooms. In another one, I used standardized test results, which you don't have here. But both of those are linked to these 3 factors. So it's important. It will affect students. It will affect the outcomes. So what do effective principals do? What do they do to change this? Well, one of the things we know is they can't do it by themselves. I said that again, and I say it again. I said it before, say it again. The important piece here is that they really need to think about teachers' work differently. And that is often very difficult because there is no template for what a newly redesigned teacher's job should look like. We have been struggling with the idea of teacher leadership in the United States for 15 years, and we still do not have an answer. So there is nothing that you can open a book. Well, you can open a book and somebody will tell you how to do it, but there's no empirical evidence that in one particular way has been proven to be the best way. But we do know that if you don't work on this as a principal, you will not get there. And there's another thing we also have to recognize, and that is that broadening your leadership and including teachers in everything is a very bad idea. Teachers are supposed to spend most of their time thinking about students and student learning and their instruction. If you have simple problems, then decide them individually. If you have complex problems, which come from some of these external pressures, then you probably need many people involved. So again, the principal needs to know not only which problems to pay attention to, but how to involve other people. That's a decision process, and my colleague Ken Leithwood has shown that experienced, expert principals make these decisions differently than new principals. So the question for principal preparation programs is, how can we guide principals at the early stages of their career to understand how they're making these decisions and whether they're making them in a way that will make teachers feel more efficacious or challenge them. So leadership is all about relationships, or school-based leadership, but universities too, I have to say. We spend a lot of our time talking to people, and Peter Grön has talked about leadership by walking about. Leadership by walking about is actually what a lot of effective principals and even rectors of universities do. They just appear and ask a good question. But leadership is about active relationships. And so let me talk a little bit about what some of those are. One of the things that we're working on in the United States, they're certainly working on it in England and the Netherlands, and I hear you working on here, is what does an instructional leader do? What do we do when we move out of the management role into the transformational leadership role? And much of that is comprised in instructional leadership. And I'm just going to use here, we have survey items, but this is what teachers say when you go in and you ask them, not you don't say, how is your principal an instructional leader, but tell us a little bit about how you work with your principal. When teachers use these words, you know what you're seeing. You can hear it. My principal visits my classroom and he comes up with a good question to ask me. Not an evaluation, not an assumption about whether I was doing well or doing poorly, but tell me a little bit about what you were doing when you delivered the lesson that way, and what were your assumptions and how did it work? Those kinds of questions. Frequent short conversations, not necessarily big, long meetings. Encouraging teachers to observe each other. One of the findings from a number of studies is that teachers who are observed by other people more frequently are happier. They like their work more. They're more innovative. They are more likely to be willing to change their instructional practice. It's counter-normative because up until recently, teachers would go in their classroom, close the door, and you'd have to knock before you could come in, at least in the United States. Maybe not here. I'm joking. But this is important because it affects working relationships and, as we've seen indirectly, the relationships that teachers have with their students both in and out of the classroom. Shared leadership. Now, it's important. Teachers actually talk about what shared leadership means. It doesn't mean giving me a job to do. It can mean that, but that's typically not the way it first starts. It starts by having teachers say, the principal listens to me, and he listens to my colleagues. It's not just me because I am important. I mean, the principal listens to us. So he doesn't always make, or she does not always make the decisions I would like them to, but I know that he's been thoughtful in listening. I think this is important. I trust him. I can tell him. I can ask him a question. I can reveal that I don't think I'm doing very well with this form in this particular part of mathematics. Maybe I could use some help. I think that's important. They get asked to present at staff meetings. So they're recognized for something that they do well. But if all teachers are assumed to do something well, a lot of people have a turn. It's not that I have an expert teacher here and the rest of you are not expert. They go out to a conference, or they learn something, or they read an article, or they're trying something. They have 5 minutes to explain it to the rest of the staff. So it's shared. Mentoring. Who's bored knowing how to mentor? We're not. Most teachers don't get training on how to mentor, and yet teachers are expected to mentor their peers. So what do principals do? They coach teachers to become good mentors for student teachers, for junior colleagues, etc., or for students for that matter. So teachers and principals actually, when there's shared leadership of this kind of informal kind, not necessarily a formal in the work contract, you get stronger teacher bonds. So they feed on each other. When teachers' bonds among themselves are stronger, they're more likely to be willing to share leadership with the principal. When the principal shares leadership, teachers are more likely to be willing to work with each other in an egalitarian manner. And I think this led me recently to a revised view of professional community, which I've always thought up until now as something that belonged to teachers. But the recent research that I've done, both qualitative and survey research, says no, there's a shared responsibility for instruction that involves the intersection between the principal and the teacher. Yes, most of it still belongs to the teacher, but the principal has to be there and to be part of that without actually saying, I teach a class. So that's part of the professional community piece. So I think that's important. This is one of those wonderful structural equation models, which I could put lots of numbers in, but I've taken them out because I thought you wouldn't want them. But it says again that the main point here is that when you have instructional leadership, shared leadership, and trust in the principal, you get stronger professional community. Teachers working together. You get more press and support for student achievement. You get higher combination there. You get better instruction, and you get better student learning. I want to draw some attention to this because it's harder to do in big schools. It's much easier. You see this much more likely to see this in smaller schools and in primary schools. These are just the more complicated the organization, the harder it is to get people around the table to discuss all of these things. It doesn't mean it's impossible. It just means that it's going to be very different, and I do believe that it needs to be addressed differently. You can't have one-size-fits-all training for how to do this for secondary and primary teachers. Okay. All right, so I'm almost at the end here. This is something that you probably have learned already because it's classic Michael Fullen. There, you implement a program, you have a change program going on, it's really hard. You get the implementation dip, which involves lots of painful effort, training, practicing, coaching, and then all of a sudden you come up to a new state of change. That's real. I mean, we have a lot of empirical evidence for that, but that's not what I'm talking about here. That's a program implementation. We have a new curriculum. We have a new instructional strategy. So it's a thing that you implement. When you're talking about culture change, it's different. Culture change is not linear. It's forever. You're stuck in this. It's weak low. No exit. Culture change involves changing processes, behaviors. Consistently, it involves attending to the outcomes. You know, and I'm not talking about outcomes as student tests. I'm talking about what do we see as resulting from the work that we're doing together. You know, how are we assessing? How are we taking the pulse of our culture? Effective, expert principals do this without having any training. Do we really want to assume that we can change our whole educational system by hiring more brilliant, natural leaders? We know that leadership can be taught. There's ample evidence for the fact that we can teach leadership. So it's probably misleading to think that we can just improve our educational systems by hiring the right people. Rather, we have to take them, choose the right people, as Jim Collins puts it, get the right people on the bus, but we also have to provide them with what Austria is talking about, which is a long-term, lifelong developmental process. Because you want every principal to have the opportunity to go from a novice to being that expert principal who can then come back and coach and mentor other younger principals. I think I've probably run over my time. I haven't actually been checking on it. I'm over, right?
Fine.
Okay. I think the important point of this slide is that learning communities, which I know are part of the conversation here in Austria, are an important foundation for culture change in schools. But they're not a silver bullet. I don't believe there are werewolves in Austria anyway, but we don't need any silver bullets here. More important is having the organizational support systems, which are the structures and the processes that are typically within and under the control of the principal. They're not mandated by the ministry. They're not covered in the teacher contract. They're the things over which, often small things, over which the principal has influence. You need to think about what motivates teachers. But motivation is it's the smaller part. If you do these things, motivation will emerge as a consequence. Motivation isn't what you start with. It's what you end up with as part of feeding into school culture. So, and in addition, the principal that's a weak tool for motivation. The principal does not have within their capacity the ability to provide motivations per se. They can have a big impact down here. And that's where I think we need to go, both with our own research, but also with the kind of action research that principals learn in their networks, that can be learned throughout the kind of multi-country network that is being proposed in the European Union. So it's not simple. It's not easy. It's a tangled mess of wire, but it is a powerful tool for leadership and for increasing the impact that principals can have on the kinds of outcomes that we want for all of our students. I've compressed 25 years of research into less than an hour. I don't think there's a Nobel Prize for that, but I will thank you for listening.